Yeah.
Great. So this is Jessica Bartlow with the Western Center on Law and Poverty's Human Services and Access to Jobs and Justice team. I'm presenting about the bills that our team as a whole worked on. And first, I just want to start out by saying, what's working in Sacramento around poverty right now is obviously not only the attention to the issue, because it is a very dire situation. We have more inequality in the country than we have in the last 100 years. And so we appreciate the attention on the issue. But it's also that we have, we as organizations of people from the grassroots to the policy tops are working together really well. And I think, the success of the legislation that I'll present today really just reflects the ways in which our organizations across the state are working together. From the grassroots identifying the issues that are most important to them, to the policy centers working with that information and developing trusted sources of real data that can be used in the legislature, and finding those policy champions that know how important these policy solutions are to their communities. So I want to start off first by talking about SB 190, Senate Bill 190, authored by Senator Mitchell and Senator Ricardo Lara. This bill was part of an equity and justice package that the pair of senators introduced at the beginning of the year that addressed the prison to, or the cradle to prison pipeline, the reality that too many children, especially children of color and living in poverty, face a path to prison more likely than a path to college or a path to prosperity. This bill specifically, what it did was ended the ability of probation departments to charge fees to families when their children were detained in youth detention centers or put on probation. And these fees amount to tens of millions of dollars annually, charged to the poorest families in the state of California. Research done by the UC Policy Center showed that these fees were not only disproportionately families of low wealth, low income families, but also disproportionately impacted families of color. And so this bill, it was a 2-year effort, and really led by the youth and their families who were impacted by the fees. The issue itself came out of the Youth Justice Coalition out of LA, a grassroots organization working with low-income youth to identify issues important to them and their families. And we worked in coalition with them and other youth justice organizations throughout the state over a 2-year period of time, with the UC Berkeley Policy Center leading on the research to result in the successful win here. Of course, our champions, Senator Lara and Senator Mitchell, were a big part of that success. So we are the first state in the country to end these fees after having charged them, and we're really proud of this work and hope that it continues. It continues to move across the country. Another really important policy victory this year is actually one that comes from many, many years of support center work. As people who know Western Center know, we serve as a support center for legal services throughout the state. And our team fields questions from legal services on public benefits issues and access to justice issues. And for years, decades in fact, Western Center has received concerns from public benefit attorneys serving their clients throughout the state that the income that is received through child support for children is actually never gets to children who live in a desperately poor household. And that, if it doesn't sound right to you, it's because it isn't. Western Center litigated for years to make sure that the child support paid to a family that's on CalWORKs is actually retained by that family and used for the basic needs of that child. Unfortunately, we lost, and we weren't alone. The poverty law centers throughout the country were losing on this issue for years. And so as a result, when child support is paid to a family receiving CalWORKs, until January 1st, 100% of that money goes to the state, except for the $50 that the family is able to retain. So SB 380 by Senator Bradford is actually changes that. And starting next year, the families that receive child support will be able to retain, many families that receive them, not all, but many families that receive child support will be able to retain a piece of that child support, or the whole part of the child support, not just a piece of it. And we expect that this will put some families further along in the poverty line, perhaps help them exit poverty, but it will also increase the likelihood that a parent, a non-custodial parent, will make payments. If today they make payments and all but $50 goes to the state government, they're less likely to make that payment. So we believe it also increases the integrity of the child support system. And we're really proud to sponsor that piece of legislation. Another piece of legislation also comes out of our support center work, and this is around the CalFresh program. In the CalFresh program, when somebody is overpaid a benefit, they're required by federal law to pay it back. They can either have that amount deducted out of their CalFresh benefit for the next month, or if they're no longer receiving aid, they have to pay it back in cash, even if they're still low income. Well, sometimes it costs more of the state government and county government to collect those dollars than the family actually owes. And so we create a system where we're spending more money to collect dollars than we actually get back. And so under the federal law, we're allowed to increase that threshold of collection and set a limit under which we wouldn't go if it would make sense and be more cost effective. And so SB 282 by Senator Wiener is a piece of legislation that directs the state of California to establish a cost-effective threshold for CalFresh overissuances and to request permission to use that threshold through our CalFresh state plan. That piece of legislation also requires counties to report to the state government when an overissuance of benefits was a result of a massive system failure, like a computer failure or abuse of decision-making by a county government. Unfortunately, we had to look at that reporting requirement because we'd seen some circumstances in which there was a major systems failure that caused an overissuance in CalFresh, not to the person's fault at all, the recipient's fault at all, but then they were being forced to pay that back. There's actually federal protections for those situations, and the state and federal government can employ those protections, but only if they know about the overissuance. So this bill simply says in the second part of the bill that they have to pursue a report to the state and inform them of that happening. The final piece of legislation I want to highlight here, and just remind you that Western Center on Law and Poverty has posted online all of these victories. You can check them out yourself with live links to the bills and analysis themselves. So we can't talk about them all here because there's a lot there to be happy about. But the final victory I want to highlight is the passage of Assembly Bill 214. This is by Dr. Shirley Weber. And this piece of legislation will help address the incidence of college hunger. No doubt, if you've been reading the news, you've seen that there's a growing incidence of college hunger and homelessness on our campuses. As we encourage low-income families to exit poverty by increased education, we have to also understand that they can't complete their college degrees if when they get to college, they can't afford their basic needs. And recent reports out of the CSUs and the UC system, but also the community college system, shows that as many as 10% of college students are experiencing homelessness, and hunger is experienced much more frequently. So this piece of legislation carries forward from a couple of years of success in this area. This is the fourth piece of legislation passed with regards to college student hunger, and what it does is establishes the final rules to ensure that students who receive CalFresh can do so using their cards at campus cafeterias, and they can purchase hot meals on campus cafeterias if they're eligible for the restaurant meal program and SNAP. It also codifies a 2-year work group that we had, which will help expand access to CalFresh, or the Supplemental Nutrition Program, to college students, and moves the ball further on next steps for ending and reducing college campus hunger. This work is especially makes me especially proud because we do it in concert with the youth on campus. The college student associations and Young Invincibles, Swipe to End Hunger, have all been partners working with us to help address college student hunger. And we can easily say that California is leading the way in addressing this issue. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop, and I'm happy to take questions at the end if we have time for that, or to receive your email questions at any point in time. Thank you.
Hey, Jess, maybe if you could just take a few more minutes to get Anya set up on this end, and maybe talk about some future things that are happening for you, and what you might be working on hard coming up.
Absolutely. So one of the things we were really proud to participate in this year was the conversation around bail reform. Just yesterday, the Harvard Law Review posted a piece about bail and the costs of bail. One thing I want to point out here is that not a lot of people know. If somebody is charged with a crime and they're sent to jail while they're pending their trial, if they leave jail because they have been bailed out, the amount that they paid to a bail agent is never returned. So if the family pays thousands of dollars in order for their loved one not to sit in jail while they're waiting their trial, those dollars never return to the family, even if the person accused of the crime is later found innocent. Even if they show up for every trial date and comply with the rules of the court completely, the money paid to bail agents never goes away. And unfortunately, as you look at wealth in California and America, most people don't have liquid assets that they can just simply hand over to a bail agent or to the courts in order to have their loved one, family member or friend, or themselves to be freed from jail while they're pending their trial. And so what happens is families end up taking credit and loans. They put their household up, or any assets they have up, as collateral for their debt to the bail agents. And frequently they're unable to pay those, and as a result, end up in further debt. This debt is not debt that goes away, and with review of that debt, the loans given to these families, they're not transparent, they're not fair. The interest rates and fees are not made available to the family in advance, and these fees are mostly paid by families who are poor. Right? If they have the access to the liquid resources, they just pay the bail themselves. So most of the bail agent costs, the bail bondsman costs, are paid by families who are poor and predominantly people of color. And it's a huge transfer of wealth from low-income communities of color to bail bondsmen. So this process is not only bad because it's bad for the resources of the family, but because research has found that for those families unable to come up with that resources, and for those people who remain in jail while pending their trial, their justice is also less equal. They tend to plead out of things of crimes they didn't commit, and to be found guilty even when they were innocent, because they were in jail during their trial. So this unequal access to justice, this price tag to justice that low-income families pay, is unfair, it's unjust, and Western Center on Law and Poverty has been proud to be a co-sponsor with several others of SB 10 and AB 42. Both of these bills were introduced one by Senator Hertzberg and the other by Assemblymember Bonta at the beginning of the year. We ended the year not passing this legislation, but instead with an announcement by the Chief Justice and the governor that they would work with us in the very short term to work towards passage of bail reform in California in 2018. We consider this to be a victory, not just that announcement, but also the work behind that announcement, the organizing that's happening, the truth-telling that's happening by low-income families and individuals in California who've been able to come forward with their stories of bail agents, and to help us all understand how unjust the system is that we have. So it is something I look forward to perhaps the most next year, to be in that place. The last piece I would highlight is a piece of legislation we did not get through by Dr. Arambula, AB 992. He's the chairman of the Assembly Budget Subcommittee over Health and Human Services, and so the proposal also showed up in the budget. And we got really close to passing this piece of legislation through and making it law, and I believe that we will be victorious next year. That we're working closely with the governor and with the legislature on the issue. And what the bill does is it would establish for the first time in state law an early home visiting program for children born into poverty and connected to the CalWORKs program. You know, we recently repealed a California state law that said that we should deny additional help to a family if they had a child born into poverty. And the science behind that policy showed that it didn't work for its purported purpose, and instead what it did was made children more desperately poor and their families less able to meet their basic needs. Well, AB 992 takes the science-based evidence that if instead of denying assistance to little children and infants born into poverty, you provide a little extra wraparound help to the family to make sure they have the services and the support that they need in the beginning, then you actually see long and short-term improved outcomes for the children. They're more prepared for kindergarten. They're more likely to graduate college. They're less likely to suffer abuse and enter into the CPS program, Child Protective Service program. They are less likely to die as an infant. Their parents are less likely to die during childbirth. The outcomes of early home visiting has been clearly documented for over 2 decades, and California is behind the curve in not offering these programs already to very poor infants and their parents. And I'm really excited about next year. I do believe that this will be something that we will achieve. And I'll stop there unless you want me to keep going. Of course, I'm an advocate, so I can go all day.
I think I'm finally on the phone. Am I here?
Hi, Anya. I hear you. I'll pass the baton.
Yay! Wonderful. Okay, so I am going to talk a little bit about the housing work that we did this year at Western Center. As people have probably heard, the legislature passed a substantial package of housing legislation this year, a 15-bill package. 6 of the bills in that package were sponsored by Western Center, and we additionally had a housing bill that was not part of the package. The package was really heavily focused on increasing supply of housing in California, particularly increasing supply at the lower income levels where we have the most tremendous shortage, and also figuring out how to sort of increase construction quickly. And we worked really hard to make sure that in doing all of this, we built in strong anti-displacement protections, and we really hammered that focus on affordability needing to be the goal, not just increasing the supply of market rate housing. So the bills that we had in that package were AB 1505 by Assemblymember Bloom, which is the long desired Palmer fix. So the bill overturns a 2009 appellate court decision that found that inclusionary zoning requirements that apply to rental housing violated the state's Costa-Hawkins Act, which regulates rent control. It was kind of a strange ruling, and it cut off inclusionary zoning at the knees in most communities because, of course, the rental side of inclusionary is where it's most meaningful and impactful. And so we've been fighting for many years to get that back, and we were finally successful this year. And actually, I just heard today that the city of San Jose has already announced that starting January 1st, their rental inclusionary requirement, which has been dormant since 2010 because of the Palmer decision, will be reinstituted. So 15% of all new construction in San Jose, rental construction, will be affordable, which is really exciting news. And certainly we hope to see other cities that had ordinances on the books prior to 2009, get those going again. And also we would encourage jurisdictions that didn't have one to pursue that now, because not having the rental side of it was really holding a lot of communities back from pursuing inclusionary policies. So that was a really exciting victory. It took us 4 times, but we finally got it done. And then the next bill I'm going to talk about was AB 1521, also by Assemblymember Bloom. This was a series of changes to the state's Affordable Housing Preservation Notice Law. This is the law that comes into effect when subsidized or deed-restricted properties are ending their affordability term, and it ensures that it is supposed to ensure that tenants and impacted local governments and preservation purchasers who might re-up the affordability of the building are all notified of what's happening and given an opportunity to preserve those buildings. Unfortunately, the law is frequently ignored and really doesn't provide enough protections. And so we changed that law in a number of ways. We added more notice requirements. We added a significant monitoring program at the Department of Housing and Community Development. So now owners of subsidized properties every single year are going to have to file a report with the Department of Housing and Community Development at the state level, certifying that they have complied with all of the requirements under the preservation notice law that applied to their property in that year. So we'll have a database, and we will have property owners sort of affirmatively saying on an annual basis that they're in compliance. So we'll be able to track and monitor more effectively. And then the other thing we changed is that we are now requiring that if a building where the covenants are expiring, if the owner of that building receives a purchase offer, a reasonable market rate purchase offer from somebody who's willing to preserve the affordability of the units, then they must sell to that preservation purchaser rather than selling the property to somebody that will convert it to market rate. So that's a really exciting and robust change to that law. And we think altogether it's going to increase compliance and hopefully drastically increase the number of properties that actually get preserved. There's about 35,000 rental units over the next 5 years in California that are going to expire. The biggest chunk of those are in Los Angeles, not surprisingly. And really, there's probably another 30,000 units every 5 years after that. And so we really want to work harder to preserve those buildings so that tenants don't get evicted because they can't afford the market rents when those buildings convert. And then another bill, AB 72, this had to do with enforcement of a wide body of housing laws. Among other things, the bill gives the Department of Housing and Community Development the authority to revoke compliance of a jurisdiction's housing element at any time during the housing element planning period, which for most jurisdictions is an 8-year period, if HCD believes that the local government has taken actions that are in violation of the housing element. Right now, the department, certifies a housing element, and that certification is essentially good for 8 years, and the department does not have the ability to take that away even when they know that the jurisdiction has done something. So there have been examples which some folks have probably heard about, where cities have literally downzoned the entire city after getting their housing element in compliance, so that they can't possibly carry out the actions that they promised through the housing element because they no longer have the density that's required to support construction. So things like that are problematic, and now HCD can take away that compliance, which puts jurisdictions in a legal bind and also creates problems with complying with a bunch of the other bills in the housing package that were passed this year. So that's exciting. And that bill also sets up a framework whereby HCD will now be referring violations of not only housing element law, but suspected violations of a number of other laws, such as density bonus law, the Housing Accountability Act, the anti-discrimination in housing laws, directly to the Attorney General for potential enforcement. So we really want to get the state to step up and do a better job enforcing some of the housing laws that are already on the books, which we know that jurisdictions frequently are violating. So that was an exciting win as well. And then we had a couple of bills, AB 1397 by Evan Lowe and SB 166 by Nancy Skinner, that strengthen housing element requirements. A big focus in the Capitol this year was on streamlining the development approval process for housing, making it faster, removing CEQA from that process so that projects can get approved quickly. But in all of those bills, the streamlining is only applicable if the project is consistent with the zoning. And we know that in many jurisdictions, there simply isn't adequate land zoned for housing, adequate sites available for development to occur, at which point streamlining becomes somewhat of a useless tool. And it's a controversial tool for a whole host of other reasons related to displacement, but that's a story for another time. But AB 1397 requires a lot more truth-telling when local governments adopt a housing element to ensure that the inventory of sites that they have listed as being available for development, and particularly affordable multifamily development, are actually sites that are real, they're available, they're buildable during the planning period. Because what we see often is sites designated for multifamily housing and a housing element that turn out not to really be available, like they have an existing business on them that's not going anywhere, or they're this teeny tiny quarter-acre parcel that can't possibly support, a multifamily development. So we require quite a bit more truth-telling in that process. And then if a jurisdiction wants to use a site in a subsequent housing element where development has not occurred, there's sort of an even higher bar to keep including a site if it's not developing consistently. So that should be helpful in making sure that affordable developers in particular have opportunities to build in every community, which they're supposed to have under current law, but unfortunately that obligation is often not really taken seriously, particularly in a lot of suburban jurisdictions. And then SB 166 effectively requires that inventory of sites to be maintained throughout the entire housing element period. So you have to be able to show at any moment in time during the 8-year planning period now that you have enough sites left that are real and available to accommodate whatever portion of your allocated housing need at every single income level that has not been built yet, which is huge because in a lot of jurisdictions right now, they may only have a handful of multifamily sites, which are critical for affordable development. And those sites frequently don't develop with affordable housing, especially now when we have so few resources available for that. And then those sites are gone. And so that effectively locks out that jurisdiction. Those sites get built at market rate. There's no more multifamily sites, which means for the entire rest of the housing element planning period, no affordable development could possibly happen. This takes that away and makes sure that there are multifamily sites constantly available throughout the planning period. So that's a really big step forward, and that's something that we've wanted for probably 20 plus years. So it's an exciting bill to have finally succeeded at. And then outside the package, so the package really focused on, as I said, supply and finance sort of things. It didn't really address anything related to renters' rights, tenant protections, things like that. But we did, separate from the package, get AB 291 by David Chiu, which is a bill that enacts significant new protections for immigrant tenants, including it prohibits landlords from threatening to call immigration authorities on tenants, and also codifies an affirmative defense to eviction based on a tenant's immigration status. So that should be a huge help. We heard many horror stories throughout the year from legal aid attorneys who were working with undocumented tenants who are being threatened by their landlords. And we hope this provides some peace of mind and significant legal protections. And then the one bill that we introduced on housing that didn't get finished this year, but that is still eligible to move in January, and we will work hard to do that, was AB 686 by Miguel Santiago. That bill is trying to enact a state affirmatively furthering fair housing obligation, similar to the requirement under federal law. Our concern has been that under the current federal administration, that obligation might disappear at some point in time. And we want to make sure that, at least in California, we retain that. And so we're trying to embed that in state law so that we don't lose all the important AFFH work that has already happened in California. And then in terms of the rest of the housing package, there were a number of bills that we worked very, very closely on, particularly two bills that strengthened the Housing Accountability Act. This act, for those of you who aren't familiar, was previously known as the Anti-NIMBY law, and it's effectively a law that makes it very difficult for a local government to deny an affordable housing project, and also provides significant protections for market rate projects as well. Unfortunately, we know that HAA claims are pretty infrequent, and oftentimes that's because developers are somewhat loath to sue local governments when they want to build in those jurisdictions, and also because local governments, the law kind of favors local governments. They tend to win these suits. So what happened this year via AB 678 and SB 166 is we shifted the review of a local government's action under the HAA from a substantial evidence test, which tends to go in the local government's favor, to a preponderance of the evidence test. So that increases the bar for local governments, and it's going to make it a lot harder for them to violate the HAA. In addition, it imposes, if it gets to a point where a claim is made, the developer wins the suit, and it's found that the local government did violate the act and they refuse to correct the violation by approving the project, the court can impose a $10,000 per unit fine on the local government, which would go into a housing trust fund to be spent on affordable units. So that was a pretty exciting win as well, because that should make that law far stronger and make it more likely that projects are going to make it through the process and get approved. So that's it. And then, of course, I should mention too, SB 2, which establishes the permanent source of funding for affordable housing in California. It wasn't the robust permanent source that advocates have been after, but it's a start, and we're excited to get going with figuring out how to implement those dollars. And then SB 3, which is going to put a $4 billion bond on the 2018 ballot to fund a variety of state affordable housing programs. So those are exciting ones as well. I think that's it on the housing front. I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have, though.
Jess, if you're still there, I know you wanted to jump in with sharing one more piece of information as well.
Oh, sure. Great. So I just wanted to also mention a piece of legislation we're really proud of. We took from beginning to end this year, which is a bill, SB 250 by Senator Hertzberg, which will end the practice of school lunch shaming in the state of California. We took on the research to find out how frequently this practice of school lunch shaming happens throughout the state, and issued a report. And let me tell you what it found. School lunch shaming is the process of treating a child different at the school lunch environment when their parents owe back debt from unpaid school lunch. And this can happen to kindergartners, first graders, all the way up through high school. The kids are denied food, or they're asked to stand in a separate line, eat food in a separate place. We found that in the state of California, the children's hands were being stamped with a stamp that said lunch money owed, so that their parents would see that they were marked. Their peers would make fun of them. Kids were denied food, even if they brought money that day for the lunch, if they owed back debt. Some kids were denied their diploma, their grades, the ability to go on field trips. Can you imagine not being able to go to the library field trip because you owed money from a previous lunch debt? This shaming of lunch debt not only hurt families that were just over the income threshold for free and reduced lunch, but it also stigmatized the entire school lunch environment and impacted low-income kids as well. One one of the worst practices was a practice of giving children with school lunch debt half of a cheese sandwich in Los Angeles Unified School District. And, you know, not a whole sandwich, half of a cheese sandwich, as almost like an intentional way to say, we want you to feel bad, that your parents owe back debt. In some circumstances, we heard from school lunch providers that children with disabilities who are unable to eat solid food were being served half a cheese sandwich blended. So this policy was applied to everybody across the board. The great news is that not only did this piece of legislation get passed, which bans the practice, but we also, because of our report, we had several school districts voluntarily chose to end their policies even before the bill was passed. And so the school district that was hand stamping kids immediately ended when they received our Public Records Act request. LAUSD, not only did they end the practice, but on August 1st, with the leadership of new school board members, they chose to establish a policy which ensures that every child receives a breakfast and a lunch. Nobody is turned away for any reason. That's, you know, that with a great statement that said, you know, that hunger should never undermine learning in the LA Unified School District. So we're really proud of this work. It's part of a national coalition, and the Food Research and Action Center has been a great partner, Maison, a Jewish Response to Hunger as well, in helping to get this achieved. We also worked really closely with the classified school employees who actually served the lunch themselves and whose jobs were at stake if they didn't follow these rules. So we're very proud of that victory as well, and we hope you'll celebrate with us. And that's it.
Wow, Jess, Anya, thank you so much for all of that information. It's amazing that you get as much done as you do, and I think part of it is from talking so quickly. We did have a question asked on if there would be a written summary of today's webinar. And I just wanted to let everyone know that on the Western Center website, as well as via email in the next week or so, we should have a list of all the bills posted, so you'll be able to get this information. And we'll also have a recording of this webinar if you want to go back and listen to it. That said, if anyone does have any questions, there is a little hand icon on the webinar that you can use to raise your hand. If you do that, I'm happy to unmute you, and you can ask Jess or Anya for some more information.
While we're waiting for questions, I'd like to throw out some kudos to the leadership, Assemblymember Rendon, who's a Speaker of the Assembly, and Senator Kevin De Leon, who's a pro tem of the Senate, and also to our governor, right? I mean, we can organize and work as hard as we can, but it does take leadership to get these kinds of victories, and I just want to acknowledge that they've been the leaders we needed this year.
Okay, and I'm not seeing any hands being raised. If you do have a question, you can also put it in the chat box. So we'll give that just another minute or so, and if we don't have any, we can wrap up. Okay, well, it looks like no questions. So Jess and Anya, it looks like you covered everything. Thank you both so much. Thank you everyone for attending, and I hope you have a terrific rest of your day.
Thanks.